we had, with my dad, we had our own basketball team.
Cute. How do you think that impacted your siblings being the oldest?
Yeah. So this is where, look, I do a lot of mindfulness in terms of, I believe that it's very, very important for us to embrace all of our thoughts. You know, look, there are thoughts that will come to you where we go, I'm not okay that I thought that, you know, like that. There are challenging thoughts every day. But if we don't deal with them, those are the ones that grow and start to become problems. The one area of my life that I continue to struggle with in terms of not really being able to embrace to a full extent the thinking is trying to come to terms with that period of my life from my family's perspective. There has been a lot of writing recently by people who, look, the memoir of someone who went through struggles with a substance is as old as time. But very recently, we've seen a new genre, and that is the story of people who loved people who went through this. And the movie with Steve Carell, Beautiful Boy, was huge, and that kind of launched this new genre to a higher extent. I couldn't see that movie. There was another one, Ben is Back. I couldn't see it because I can't imagine what it was like going through this from my family's perspective. And, that's a weakness that I just am not ready to overcome.
Okay. Where it shows again that you're human.
I hope so.
Oh, wow. Now with the people that you coach, how do you get them on the right path?
So that's very, very important. And what's the most important part there is establishing what is the right path. For a long time, we as a society embraced the idea first popularized in the 50s and 60s by AA, and that is that sober is the only way to enter recovery and to stay in recovery. Now, thankfully, in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, there have been people challenging that, both inside the recovery community and outside. We're seeing a rise in medically assisted treatment, which is people who are switching from one opioid to another that isn't nearly as physically dependent. We are seeing a rise in what we call harm reduction, which is the idea that, look, we can't force someone to stop using. I mean, that's literally not possible unless you hold them down. But what you can do is make it safer for them to continue using. And then hopefully they'll get to a point where they go, I don't think that these drugs are the right thing for me. Or a third camp is people who use in a safe way, and you just want to make sure that they continue to do so in that safe way. So what's very important to me is if I'm working with anyone who is currently using, it's making sure that they're doing so in a safe way. And then for people who are not, their issue is not issues of substance misuse, that they're just everyday people who need help, with good mental health habits. It's listening to them about where their life is. Because, look, I could come in with an amazing action plan, but if we get through the first session, they're like, that doesn't really fit what I'm looking to do. Well, I'm not going to keep them as a client. So it's very important to listen to where people are and help them set goals for themselves, and then we work together to achieve those goals.
Okay, so it's based on what they want to do and like their goals, like you just said.
Yep. Yeah, I like to think of it as my relationship to my client and my client's therapist is I am your personal trainer. Your therapist is your doctor. You're not going to come to me as your personal trainer and say, hey, my back's bothering me. I'm going to say, hey, go to your doctor. The same way that you wouldn't go to your doctor and say, hey, man, how much do you think I should be lifting at the gym? He's going to be like, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. So that's the relationship, is that we need to work on what is your plan of attack? What is your goal here? And let's make sure that's achievable for you. I'm a runner. I that's my way of exercise. If I went out tomorrow and ran a marathon, I would probably die. I've run a half marathon and it almost killed me. So if I went to a trainer and said, "Hey man, I want you to help me run a marathon," he's gonna hopefully tell me, "All right, this is gonna take us a year to get you to that point." And if he doesn't, if he says, "All right, man, let's go run it tomorrow," there's a problem there.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm with you. I'm still on your table. Now, here's a question for you. And I ask this because I could totally be wrong. Me and really official things aren't the accurate thing. But I do remember a little while ago, Denver was, a lot of people were contemplating on the decision to implement safe usage facilities. And a lot of people were against it. I used to work at a gym and I had a couple of members like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Or "I think this is stupid," or whichever, because, everyone has their opinion and it's right.
Sure.
What would you say to someone who is like, safe usage or healthy usage isn't a real thing?
So this is one of my favorite topics to cover. So I'm really glad you brought this up. Very recently, as of, man, what are we in, June? So as of like 3 months ago, right before COVID, the city of Philadelphia actually had it legally approved to open their first safe consumption site. And that was the biggest win in the harm reduction community in a long time, because not only we've had other cities, you mentioned Denver, that were trying to move ahead with this without official sanctioning, and it just didn't get off the ground. So Philadelphia was ready to do this. Unfortunately, the not in my backyardism overcame the victory, and the person who was leasing them the space took their lease away. So it didn't happen. And from what I understand, they're going back to the drawing board. But this was a big deal. And what I would say is, let's examine why people are against it. And I mean that in the most respectful way, but also understanding that a lot of the reasons you're against this are probably misconceptions. Now, and I can, list a couple of them. Number one, people were against giving people drugs. And the pushback on that is, look, we can go into drug law. That's a different podcast, and we're going to be talking for a while, especially as groups like DPA, which is an amazing national organization, are trying to educate people on just how much of our drug laws are based in, the worst racism. It is astounding if you read some of these things. Jay-Z, just to kind of name drop for a minute, put out a call, this was not that long ago, that was like, educate yourselves on these issues. Our drug laws in the U.S. are to a law based on racism, even to the point where Richard Nixon, the amazing president that he was, admitted that his goal in ending, in crushing some of these drug usages was to drive blacks and hippies away from voting and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of nuts. So, wow. Yeah, it's fascinating that the drug laws in our country are all built on nothing except for racism. So very interesting. But back to the point of the safe consumption site, nobody was ever advocating for giving anyone drugs. What they were trying to do is allow them to use in their presence in a safe way, no arrests, and then give them clean needles, give them oversight. So if someone did unfortunately overdose, there was somebody there to resuscitate them. And if they couldn't, they could be taken directly to a hospital. It was essentially a way to protect not only the user, but to cut down on transmission of some really terrible diseases that are passed by using unclean needles. So that's number one. And number two is it cuts down on crime. If you take away the criminality of using, then you can actually start to free up law enforcement for other things. I know that right now that's not the greatest topic, and police funding and what they're using that funding on is in the headlines as it should be. But moving them away from criminalizing people whose only crime is acquiring drugs that keeps them from going through withdrawal, it's hard to be against that, I would say.
I see. That's a good answer.
Thank you.
That's a good answer. And it has background to it versus, oh, we're just helping people, but it has a reason and a cause and a background to it.
Yeah, I love talking about drug laws because it's fascinating to me how many people don't recognize, and it's not their fault. You know, these laws existed way before you or I were born, but so many of them were blatantly passed for racist reasons, and it's been forgotten because it was so long ago. You know, the first, we love to talk about how there's a sentencing difference for crack cocaine and powdered cocaine because, you know, mostly at the time there was this misconception that only black people use crack and only white people use powder, which wasn't true even then. But even before that, which, by the way, I need to make that clear, that's terrible. We need to get rid of that disparity. But even before then, in the early 1900s, it was legal to use one type of opium, but it wasn't legal to smoke it because there was an idea, for whatever reason, that only Asian people smoked opium. And so they made smoking opium illegal, but allowed it in other contexts. And it was blatant. I mean, they said that in passing this law, that it was cracking down on these, you know, these undesirables. These things are all based in racism, and we're not willing to challenge them because we've allowed people to teach us that this makes us safer, which isn't true.
Wow. You gave us some history there too. Appreciate it.
Doing my best.
Now, with your knowledge and speaking and podcasting now, you could add that to your mantra of things.
That's right.
Are you writing as well and writing a knowledgeable book either on your story or about just to educate people?
Yeah, that's so I started it before COVID. I was doing an interview book with people who are mostly on the front lines and are trying to come at this in an unconventional or unique way. You know, no offense to people who have been doing this for 20 years, but their stories have been told. You know, that the people who are running AA or treatment centers that use 12 steps or whatever, they're all great stories, but you can find them anywhere. In case in point, I get Google alerts for whenever there's a story published about addiction. And during COVID, for days on end, I finally had to stop opening these emails because I was so annoyed with them. The only stories being written about substance misuse and recovery were how people who go to meetings are holding meetings online, which is a fine story. Don't get me wrong, but that's like maybe a quarter of the whole pie, and we're only talking about that. So my book was going to tackle some of these other stories, and I got 3 interviews in, and I had 3 more scheduled. My goal was 12, and then COVID shut down all travel. So it was important to me to be there and see these people in action. It's one thing to have awesome conversations like this. It's another thing to follow you around for a while and see you do this. So I didn't feel comfortable continuing the interviews over Zoom. And my hope is when we're feeling more comfortable to travel, that I'll be able to make up those ones I had to cancel and then start back up again. But at this point, you know, this idea I had about getting the book out next year probably isn't going to happen. So maybe 2022 at this point. Okay.
And who do you want to target with this book?
I think it's important to help change some perspective here. And that is, like I was saying, for a long time, we had this idea that AA and sober living and 12 steps were the only way. And again, I want to make it clear that there's nothing wrong with that. That those are all very established methods, but they only they really only help about a third of the people who are working towards entering some sort of recovery for substance misuse. And AA doesn't do a lot for mental health as a whole. So my